So thank God the midterms are over. I don't know about all of you, but the national obsession and the constant references to poll numbers was driving me nuts. And of course, now that we're past November, we can focus on the poll numbers for 2020. I have struggled to think of something useful to say about what happened in Pittsburgh's Squirrel Hill neighborhood at the Tree of Life Synagogue, and Highland Park, Michigan, where a Muslim family's home was destroyed. They had to leap out of the windows in order to avoid being burned to death. And of course, Jefferson, Kentucky, where 2 African Americans were murdered by white supremacists. And of course, the 2 women who were murdered in Florida by what we call an incel movement activist, a man who hates women. Maybe it's all been said. I'll say this: it makes me angry, not fearful. More disturbing is that I wasn't surprised. And I'll get into that. The world changed in a shocking way. November the 8th, 2016. Donald Trump, a man who relies upon anger, bigotry, lying, and fear-mongering to fuel his entire existence, is now President of the United States. We've begun to experience what this historic transformation actually means. 1 week after the election, I spoke to a group in Cleveland, Ohio. The topic was supposed to be implicit bias or hidden bias. That's not where I went then, it's not where I'm going today. Arguably, over the past 2 years, we're back to an era when bias, especially the rejection of diversity, is not just hidden in the larger population, it is open and it is extensive. What the Southern Poverty Law Center observed during the campaign and since the election and inauguration has been an invigoration of extremists and extremist groups ranging from old Klan leaders to neo-Nazis, other white supremacists, and radical anti-immigrant groups. They feel validated. I'll get to that later as well. Now, I'd like to talk about the history that I experienced, one of explicit bias that I believe provides a valuable lesson for the present. I was born in 1943, a pre-boomer, I guess. My father was Jewish, a native of Newport News, Virginia. In 1882, my great-grandparents, Isaac and Annie Lippman, their ages 16 and 15 at the time, and married, walked from Odessa in Russia to Bremen, Germany. They were escaping the ethnic cleansing instituted by Alexander III. Alexander III succeeded his father, and like many of the Romanovs, he had a global vision for Russia. He was committed to making Russia great again through intense nationalistic and isolationist policies. That may sound familiar. My dad had an easier trip. He migrated to college at the University of Alabama and graduated from his law school in 1934. Moved to Montgomery to practice law with a classmate and eventually established his own commercial practice. My mother, Ann Hutto, was born in Jasper, Alabama, a descendant of generations of farmers, the youngest of 14 siblings. She moved to Montgomery, met my father, and they married. My mother was raised a Baptist but converted to Judaism. On her side, the Ottos, as they were known when they immigrated from Germany to South Carolina around 1735, likely left Germany because of the religious persecution of Lutherans. My great-grandfather, John C. Hutto, was a major in the Confederate Army. There's a Sons of Confederate Veterans Camp, as they call it, named for him in Walker County, Alabama. I heard a lot about Johnny Reb from my uncles growing up. I could not have imagined that the Confederacy and its symbols would rise again to such prominence. I never knew anything as a kid but Jim Crow segregation. Racially separate water fountains formed a metaphor for the culture. Every white person I knew was a racist, and so was I. And just in case you think that growing up Jewish made a difference, it didn't. Jews as a group were just as bigoted as anyone else. Those who weren't, a couple of Yankee rabbis, were run out of town by their congregations. Assimilation was the name of the game. In 1955, the bus boycott occurred. I was 12 years old, and until then, I rode the bus every day. The day the boycott began was the last day I rode public transportation in Montgomery. Conversations included discussions of outside agitators, and Yankee trash stirred up the Negroes. The city proceeded to close down the public parks and concrete in the public pools in order to avoid court-ordered desegregation. The atmosphere in Montgomery was poisonous. There was little justice. Some of the lawyers and judges were the worst offenders. Judge Walter B. Jones, Montgomery County Circuit Court judge, was a vicious racist. In 1957, 6 years before his death, Jones published his most infamous editorial in the Montgomery Advertiser, the local newspaper where he was a frequent commentator. It was entitled, "I Speak for the White Race." And sadly for his time, maybe ours, I think he did. He concluded his racist diatribe with the following words: "We have all kindly feelings for the world's other races, but we will maintain at any and all sacrifices the purity of our blood strain and race. We shall never submit to the demands of integrationists. The white race shall remain forever white." If this sounds familiar, it's the voice of white supremacy and the alt-right of today, not 1957, today. And these people were representative of the larger community. It's like what a wise commentator once said about the Texas legislature: if you think these folks are bad, you ought to see their constituents. Sounds pretty harsh, but this was our environment. One of the perversion of law, an oligarchy with wealth and power concentrated in the hands of a few who played on racism to keep working class whites thinking about something else. The clarion call was states' rights, states' rights, states' rights. You might think that that was surely my motivation to get a law degree and work to correct the vast injustices all around me. Not hardly. As a noted author, Anais Dean, put it, there are very few human beings who receive the truth by instant illumination. Most of them acquire it fragment by fragment. When I left my lily-white public schools in Montgomery in 1960, I entered the all-white University of Alabama and joined my all-white Jewish fraternity. There were Christian fraternities and Jewish fraternities and sororities back then. Within the Jewish student body, we had fraternities then for Southern Reform Jews, Southern Conservative Jews, and of course Yankee Jews. There was no line left undrawn. We thrilled to our all-white football team. Bear Bryant had been there for a couple of years at that point, which gave us, number one, the opportunity to refight the War of Northern Aggression, and number two, show solidarity with George Wallace. In what was my junior year, 1962, a fraternity brother, Melvin Meyer from Starkville, Mississippi, wrote a crimson-white school newspaper editorial supporting integration. And he was actually talking about the integration of Ole Miss by James Meredith. That resulted in a barrage of hate calls to the fraternity house where most of us lived at the time. And one morning there was a lot of commotion in the house. I was asleep, got awakened, went downstairs, out into the front yard. There was a 10-foot cross burning. It had been placed there by the United Klans of America that was then headquartered in Tuscaloosa. By the way, the Southern Poverty Law Center put them out of business a few decades later. The Klan was mad at Melvin. The Klan was mad at Melvin. I and many of my contemporaries at the university were mad at Melvin. And back in my hometown, in the Jewish community, the Jews were mad at Melvin, wondering why we tolerated such a radical in our midst. It was quite a combination of critics. What Melvin wrote and the way I and others reacted to it changed the course of my thinking and began to alter my view of the world. So in 1966, I graduated from law school, practiced a bit with my dad, and then went to Fort Benning for basic officers training. Back in the day, unless you were a draft dodger, like Dick Cheney and Donald Trump, and yes, Bill Clinton, you likely got drafted, you enlisted, or you came out of college, grad school, or law school, with the 2-year ROTC obligation. For me, I was in Army intelligence. I finished my basic infantry officer training at Fort Benning, Georgia, 6 weeks at Military Intelligence School, Fort Holabird, Maryland, which no longer exists. I was prepared to go straight to Vietnam, as had virtually all of my infantry and intelligence classmates. Then New York City intervened. And I know you wonder, what in the hell is he talking about? Well, the Army sent me to Manhattan. And we don't have time for that story. But what I did get out of my 2 years in the city was a sense of the larger world, a sense of diversity, colleagues of all races, ethnic backgrounds, and religions. I worked with Jewish cops. I didn't even know there were Jewish cops. And though seemingly contradictory, I came to realize both how irrelevant and how important those differences were. So it brought me to that last fragment that Melvin had initiated 7 years earlier. Serendipity intervened in 1969. I returned to Montgomery and met Morris Eads. We tried some cases together, started a law firm, and in 1971, with the help and encouragement of the late Julian Bond, who served as our first president, we started the Southern Poverty Law Center. I was very lucky. I found a use for my law degree that I never could have imagined. In its first decade, the Southern Poverty Law Center desegregated the all-white Alabama State Trooper Force, George Wallace's cops, created an Alabama legislature that went from 1 black representative in 1972 to 19 by 1974, desegregated the Montgomery YMCA, which had entered into a secret agreement with the city to essentially act as a public recreational provider for its white residents, required the United States military to treat male and female service members equally in the provision of benefits, and stop the federal government from funding the forced sterilizations of poor women, and much more. Litigation was the primary focus of those early years, but as the 80s and 90s rolled into view, the center established Klan Watch, the predecessor organization to our current program, Intelligence Project. The Intelligence Project operates as a check on the activities of a broad array of hate groups and is a resource for law enforcement at all levels of government. We filed cases and recovered millions of dollars in damages from hate groups in Texas, Alabama, North Carolina, Kentucky, and Oregon. In 1989, we unveiled the Civil Rights Memorial, designed by My Lin and dedicated to the martyrs of the Civil Rights Movement. And in 1992, the center initiated its Teaching Tolerance program, which among many other activities distributes tolerance material and award-winning video and text kits free of charge to schools all over the country. So we arrived in the 21st century with all the proven programs in place and others underway. There's our Juvenile Justice Initiative operating in Florida, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, taking unprecedented steps to improve the lives of children caught in the school-to-prison pipeline. Our economic justice litigation attacking the criminalization of poverty. Prison reform seeking, among other things, the provision of adequate mental health services to the incarcerated. Our Immigrant Justice Project, which is fighting for immigrant labor throughout the South through litigation and administrative action. How that mission has changed over the past 2 years. We originally directed our attention to the abuse of documented and undocumented immigrants by the agricultural and timber industries in the South. Since Trump took office, we've radically changed direction by establishing our Southeast Immigrant Freedom Initiative, the purpose of which is to provide representation to the thousands of immigrants being shoved into deportation centers around the country. We now have projects in 5 different locales, 3 in Georgia, 1 in Louisiana, and 1 in Florida. We've also partnered financially and programmatically with other groups trying to address the flooding of these centers. It is a huge problem. We have an extensive LGBT rights project, which includes litigation that has successfully struck down debunked conversion therapy programs, ensured military benefits to same-sex couples, and again, much more. As I prepared this talk and looked back over the last 47 years and thought about where we started and where we are now as a country, it brings me back to my main point. Where are we? What country is this? I thought the stories of bigotry and hate were relegated to the fringes of our society. I was wrong. I see, smell, and feel the 1950s and 1960s. Again, we see the Tree of Life synagogue. We see the bomber who threatened political activists all over the country. The Michigan Muslim family that I mentioned, homes burned to the ground. The murder of 2 African Americans, 2 women who were murdered in the Florida yoga studio by the incel activists. We see this happening this year, recently. In 1920, H.L. Mencken wrote this: "As democracy is perfected, the office of the president represents more and more closely the inner soul of the people. On some great and glorious day, the plain folks of the land will reach their heart's desire at last, and the White House will be occupied by a downright fool and a complete narcissistic moron." Rex Tillerson must have read that before I did. After Charlottesville, a Washington Post ABC News survey revealed that almost 10% of Americans believe it's acceptable to hold white supremacist or neo-Nazi views. That's almost 30 million people who strongly agreed with that statement. More frightening to me was that 41% had no opinion on the matter. That's 41% after Charlottesville. 42% of the survey rightly thought that Trump had put neo-Nazis and white supremacists on equal standing with those who oppose them. More recently, a poll that was conducted by Reuters and Ipsos in connection with the University of Virginia Center for Politics found this, among other things, that 31% of respondents said they strongly or somewhat agreed that the country needs to protect and preserve its white European heritage. 39% strongly or somewhat agreed that white people are currently under attack in this country. Nearly a third of the respondents failed to express support of interracial marriage, with 16% agreeing that marriage should only be allowed between 2 people of the same race. Now, 14% neither agreed nor disagreed, 4% said they just didn't know. An analysis by the pollsters found that those who gave different answers were more likely to have views that leaned toward intolerance than away from it. So what is the inner soul of our people, those who are most at risk? Undocumented immigrants, people of color, religious minorities, especially American Muslims and Jews, everyone in the LGBTQ community, women who deserve control of their own bodies, have every right to be afraid. This kind of overt bigotry has been justified by our president, his vice president, and their various surrogates. The extremist and alt-right elements of our country feel that their positions regarding white supremacy, anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim, hate of LGBTQ individuals, xenophobia, misogyny have been fully validated. These views were only enhanced by Trump's behavior and words following Charlottesville and his overtly racist remarks regarding Haitians and Africans, SOs, you may recall. Beginning virtually all of his remarks with on immigration with illustrations of crimes committed by undocumented immigrants, rapists, murderers, MS-13, animals, breeders. Of course, there he wants to end birthright citizenship. And don't forget John Kelly, his chief of staff. Don't forget John Kelly's references to unregistered DACA kids as lazy and can't get off the couch, can't get off their asses. Classic racist terminology. And of course, this Trump puppy, Stephen Miller, claiming that the poem containing some of the most meaningful words our nation has ever known was not really the message of the Statue of Liberty, because it was installed in 1903, 17 years after the Statue of Liberty was erected in 1886. It should be pointed out that the poem was originally written as part of a fundraising campaign for the erection of the statue, 3 years before the lady would become part of the New York Harbor and Manhattan skyline. By the way, I did some very limited research on Stephen Miller's ancestry. Ironically, his mother's family immigrated from Belarus in the early 1900s, escaping the Russian pogroms. They had nothing, and his great-grandmother only spoke Yiddish, so I guess he wouldn't let her in today. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuge of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. After the election, and even before Charlottesville, Trump's very fine people's statement, Kevin McDonald, an outspoken anti-Semite former professor, wrote this: "This is an amazing victory. Fundamentally, it is a victory of white people over the oligarchic, hostile elites." Andrew England, who is pride of the Daily Stormer, it's a website popular among neo-Nazis, declared this: "Our glorious leader has ascended to God Emperor. Make no mistake about it, we did this." White nationalist leader Richard Spencer praised Trump's statement commemorating International Holocaust Remembrance Day that omitted any reference to Jews. He called it the de-Judification of the Holocaust. And former Klansman David Duke, about whom Trump once claimed to know nothing, that was a lie, said, "President Trump is off to an amazing start. God bless him for it. We simply want our own country and our own society." Now remember, this all occurred before Charlottesville, which only strengthened white supremacist views of Trump's support for them and their dogma. The number of hate groups operating in the country in 2017 remained at near historic highs. It rose from 892 in 2015, 917 in 2016, to 954 in 2017. It's only 64 fewer hate groups that the Southern Poverty Law Center had identified in 2011, which was 1,018. That's in 30 years of hate counts. We added 2 male supremacy groups to the hate list for the first time this year. This was before what happened in Florida, the yoga studio. Because the vilification of women by these groups makes them no different than other hate groups that malign an entire class of people. The male supremacy movement believes that women are not people and that men should hold a superior place in society. According to these groups, all women are genetically inferior, manipulative, and stupid. Not sure how you can be both manipulative and stupid, but that's a The groups reduce women to their reproductive or sexual functions. They're called Voice for Men and Return of Kings. And incidentally, there's a huge component of this in white supremacist groups in general. As the Southern Poverty Law Center reported, in the first 3 months after Trump won the presidency, we recorded an astonishing 1,372 hate incidents, nearly all of them election-related. A deep dive into the data revealed that nearly half of these incidents involved people referencing Trump either by name or by parroting his rhetoric. For example, groups of white thugs intimidating minorities while chanting Trump, or swastika graffiti accompanied by the words, "Make America Great Again." By far, the most dramatic change for the last 2 years, 16 and 17, was the enormous leap in anti-Muslim hate groups. Anti-Muslim hate expanded from 34 in 2015 to 101 in 2016 to 114 in 2017. That's a more than 235% increase. That's driven by the unrelenting propaganda of a growing circle of well-paid ideologues and the incendiary rhetoric of Trump. His threats to ban Muslim immigration, mandate a registry of Muslims in America, and more. The Muslim bashing had consequences. For example, in October of 2016, just before the election, 3 members of a militia-like group called the Crusaders were arrested and charged with plotting to blow up an apartment complex in Kansas where 120 Somali Muslim immigrants live. The attack was reportedly set for November the 9th, not coincidentally, the day after the election. They were convicted just this year. You'll recall the white supremacist, a fan of neo-Nazis and other extremists, who murdered 2 men and injured another, who were trying to protect 2 Muslim women who were being verbally threatened on a train in Portland, Oregon. Beyond the anti-Muslim events, there was the murder in New York City of Timothy Coleman, a black man, by a known white supremacist, killing of Richard Collins III, a black man on the University of Maryland campus by a neo-Nazi sympathizer. Just this year, Blaise Bernstein, an openly gay Jewish student, murdered by a neo-Nazi in California. And in my own hometown of Montgomery, a gay woman was physically attacked and injured after leaving a local bar where LGBTQ individuals had been ridiculed by this unidentified person. During the attack, the man said this is now Donald Trump's America. Last spring, the SPLC published a report showing that for 2014 through 2017, more than 100 people have been killed or injured by alleged perpetrators influenced by the alt-right, a movement that continues to access the mainstream and reach young adults. Since 2014, there have been 13 such episodes, leaving 43 dead and more than 60 injured. 9 of the 12 incidents, and remember, I'm not talking about 2018 here, 9 of the 12 incidents we identified occurred in 2017 alone, making Donald Trump's first year in office the most violent year for the movement. 17 dead, 43 wounded. And as I said, all before the most recent murders. Our report also finds that of the 12 alleged or convicted killers connected to this new generation of white supremacists, the average age of the perpetrators is 26 years. Only 3 have been older than 30, with the youngest being just 17. And just to add to the list, Nicholas Cruz, the 19-year-old who slaughtered 17 people at the Stoneman Douglas High School, in a private Instagram group chat, repeatedly espoused racist, homophobic, and anti-Semitic views and displayed an obsession with guns and violence. In one part of the group chat, Cruz wrote this, that he hated Jews, N-word, and immigrants. He talked about killing Mexicans, keeping black people in chains, and cutting their necks. As for gays, Cruz said, shoot them in the back of the head. White women drew Cruz's hatred as well, specifically those in interracial relationships, whom he referred to repeatedly as traitors. And to make my larger point, there's an Instagram picture with Cruz wearing a Make America Great Again hat. This past Tuesday, the FBI reported a 17% increase in hate crimes in 2017. That's probably a low number. They don't get all the crimes in their records. As Voltaire stated, if I can get you to believe absurdities, I can get you to commit atrocities. So here's Donald Trump, a man with no ideology, no principles, an empty vessel. Is he a racist? Is he a misogynistic predator? Is he a xenophobe? Is he an anti-Semite? Is he an all-around bigot? To paraphrase a John Bright quote, Trump believes he is a self-made man and worships his creator. In early 2016, Matthew Heimbach, who was then head of the Traditionalist Youth Network, it's a white supremacist group, described Donald Trump as the gateway drug to outright white nationalism. He was right then, and he's right now. As an aside, but it's irrelevant, right here in Mississippi on I-10, a Latino family vacationing in a large van was stopped and detained by the Hancock County Sheriff's Office for more than 4 hours because, as one deputy put it, he was looking for illegals. It was a group of 8. The father, Marcos Martinez, who has lawful permanent residence here, his wife, Stephanie, and their 3 children, each American citizens, the father's 83-year-old mother, his sister, and a family friend, each with valid visas. Marcos was repeatedly threatened by the same deputy, said he was looking for illegals, with losing his permanent residency if he did not admit to possessing drugs. Despite 2 invasive searches and extensive questioning, no drugs or evidence of any criminal activity was found. Repeated threats were made to the mother, to Stephanie, that she was going to be separated from her children. The family's only crime was that they looked Latino. Stephanie said this: "We don't want anyone else to have to go through what we went through. I don't want my kids to grow up in a world where they will suffer discrimination because of the color of their skin." The Southern Poverty Law Center has sued the Sheriff's Office on behalf of the family. So what can we do to mitigate the hate and rebuild the inner soul of our country? It's all about community. Speak up in the community. Work in the community. When you hear attacks on immigrants, LGBTQ individuals, American Muslims, Jews, other racial and religious minorities, whoever the others may be, say something. Don't let it go unanswered. Make sure that in the future, the inner soul of our people bends toward truth, compassion, and justice. This past Tuesday, actually maybe it was 2 weeks ago, I'll lose track of time, the Jewish Federation of Central Alabama hosted a community event in Montgomery. Participants included Jews, Christians, Unitarians, Muslims, and just plain unaffiliated citizens. One of the important themes was that hope is not enough. We must act. As Dr. King said, in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. He said this also: if you can't fly, then run. If you can't run, then walk. If you can't walk, then crawl. But whatever you do, you have to keep moving forward. Our slogan at the Southern Poverty Law Center is, "The march continues." Maybe Winston Churchill got it right. You can always count on Americans to do the right thing once they've exhausted every other possibility. I end here with a quote that's very important in this era of Trump, Pence, Kelly, Whitaker, Miller, Pompeo, and Bolton. Anti-Muslim immigration restrictions, DACA repeal, and general xenophobia. America has never been united by blood or birth or soil. We are bound by ideals that move us beyond our backgrounds, lift us above our interests, and teach us what it means to be citizens. Every child must be taught these principles. Every citizen must uphold them. And every immigrant, by embracing these ideals, makes our country more, not less, American. We all came here for a reason. Juntos podemos. Together we can. Make America not just wealthy, but generous and just. That was George W.